Force One is currently in international waters for the first time in history, flying over the recently renamed Gulf of America.
President Trump chose the exact moment flying over the Gulf of Mexico to formally announce he would rename it, as promised, as the Gulf of America.
And we're flying right over it right now. So we thought this would be appropriate.
It may not be legal, and Mexico certainly hasn't agreed, but it's all part of Trump's plan to project American strength, as was his next airborne announcement, to slap tariffs on all imports of steel and aluminium.
Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum, too.
So who gets hit the hardest? Well, Canada, by far, which exports more than $8 billion worth of iron and steel to the US. Then Brazil, which supplies over $4 billion. Mexico is the third largest provider, while Germany exports nearly $1.5 billion worth. And the UK, a much smaller provider, still exports nearly $500 million worth.
Now is the time for collaboration, not confrontation.
Reaction against Trump's tariffs was swift, as was the threat of retaliation.
We stand against unjustified barriers to free and fair trade. We will always take the necessary steps to protect our economic interests.
Trade wars are painful for everyone, negative for everyone, and that's something that you should do between friends.
Pues vamos a esperar. Es como digo aquí.
Well, let's wait. With a cool head on this, we'll wait to see if anything is announced today, and from there, we will make our decisions.
It was only a week ago that Mexico and Canada thought they'd seen off a trade war with America after both countries agreed to increase border security in exchange for Trump delaying tariffs on all their exported goods. Yet here we are again. Trump typically frames his tariffs as punishment against foreign countries for not playing fair with the United States. But the reality is it's US companies that will pay the tariffs on imported goods. Things like steel, aluminium, tech products. And they won't just absorb those costs themselves, they will pass them down to US consumers. So while Trump is hoping the tariffs will raise billions of dollars in revenue for the US, it will also raise prices for everyday Americans, and that will ultimately hurt the American economy. But the Americans at last night's Super Bowl weren't worried about a trade war. There were some boos, but most greeted Trump with cheers as he became the first sitting president to ever attend the NFL championship. And much to his delight, some even booed Taylor Swift, who'd endorsed Kamala Harris, remember, for president, and whose boyfriend was on the losing team. While the halftime show performer, Kendrick Lamar, was also on point with an America First flag of performers. It's all about being seen to be strong and tough, even if the trade wars hurt America too, like the Chinese tariffs that kick in against the US today. Trump says he'll simply hit back, with more tariff turmoil promised for later this week. Well, the president is due to sign an executive order on those steel tariffs sometime this afternoon from the Oval Office, and then I think we can expect a retaliatory wave coming back towards the US, and then everybody, especially the EU, needs to brace for the next round of tariffs, which the president says is coming tomorrow or Wednesday, and which he is calling reciprocal tariffs that will be placed on against any and all countries, he says, that charge the US for its goods and services. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's cost-cutting frenzy continues apace here in Washington, D.C. He did have some setback today, after a judge has ordered him to unfreeze the payment of billions of dollars worth of federal grants and loans. And so worried are 5 former Treasury secretaries about Musk and his men that they've penned a piece today in the New York Times saying that they are expressing their alarm for his overreach, which they claim is both unlawful and corrosive, they say, to our democracy. That doesn't seem to be stopping Musk and Trump, both of whom have said that the Department of Education and even America's military will be next on the chopping block.
Thanks, Siobhan. Well, the UK steel industry has warned that American tariffs could deal it a devastating blow, affecting thousands of jobs across the country. Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is with me.
UK steel, about 40% of it, Krish, goes abroad. And while the majority goes to Europe, the second largest market is the US. And we're talking about high-value goods that goes to defence, to aerospace. And they're made in places like Sheffield, Rotherham, Hartlepool. These are areas that are politically important to Labour. They're well-paid jobs, which is why the industry has an expectation that the UK government will either step in to financially insulate them or that they'll work out some kind of carve-out from the Trump administration. And remember, in Trump's first term, he launched the same steel tariffs. And fast forward a couple of years, and US steel was running at a massive premium to the rest of the world. That was very bad for American consumers, and Biden had to backtrack. Today, Krish, let me tell you that you saw metals prices in New York surging $800 over UK prices.
Right, so tariffs are one bit of Trumponomics. What's the rest of it? How's it going?
Well, the president clearly uses tariffs, as Siobhan was saying, as a negotiating tool, but there were also a tax on imports, and that is desperately important in his battles with the upcoming budget. And here's the problem. US government spends a massive $7 trillion. Now, 4.2 trillion of that is mandatory. It's Social Security, it's Medicaid, it can't be touched. Another $1 trillion or so is the national credit card debt interest bill. That leaves about $1.8 trillion. That's the kind of stuff Siobhan was talking about, Elon Musk setting his sights on. But about half of that is defence. Now, finding a way to make all of these numbers add up is, exposes another economic fact, one that a lot of economists say shows that the US economy is going in the wrong direction. Now, this is the 100-year picture of US debt. It's rising relentlessly and set to go even higher. Now, many economists blame Biden's for an inflationary boom, which added to this debt pile. And the question for the Trump presidency is whether he'll be able to turn it around or whether his own market interventions will cause inflation and make all of that much worse.
Thanks, Helia. Now, Professor Jason Furman was for 4 years the most senior economic advisor to President Obama and attended the US cabinet. Today, he published an article, The Post-Neoliberal Delusion, about mistakes he believes the Biden administration made, including diverting too much from what is sometimes called neoliberalism. I spoke to him shortly before we came on air and began first by asking what he thinks of Trumponomics so far.
So far, Trumponomics seems to just be absolute love of tariffs. And as a card-carrying economist, I'm not such a fan of that approach. Tariffs are already adding a little bit to inflation, and each new wave of them will add even more, which is exactly the opposite, of course, of what President Trump was elected to do.
But I suppose he thinks it's going to raise a lot of money for him to spend, which I mean, can that alleviate things in any way?
It's going to raise some money, but don't worry, that money's going to be spent. It's going to be spent several times over. There's trillions of dollars of tax cut proposals. The other thing is you might think it's going to help people who have jobs in manufacturing, and it will help some of them. If you make steel, the tariffs probably help you. But if you make cars or you're in the construction industry, the tariffs are going to hurt you because they're raising the price of one of the inputs to your business.
So, I mean, there is no other way of looking at it than this is going to do more damage than good to America.
Yeah, I think you're going to get less imports and they're going to be more expensive. You're going to get less exports. And for every job there is in the steel industry, there's about 80 or 90 jobs in industries that use steel. And every one of those 80 or 90 jobs will be hurt by this measure.
So I guess, I mean, do you see tariffs as more political than economic?
Yeah, look, there are important economic issues vis-a-vis China. But we actually already have 25% tariffs on steel that comes from China. So what's new here is tariffs on Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Europe, all sorts of very close partners of the United States. So I don't quite know what we're trying to accomplish in terms of negotiation, the economy. But yeah, you're raising a bit of money.
I mean, Trumponomics also, it seems to involve big spending cuts, and that's what he's got Elon Musk in to do. I mean, how much is that going to help him?
So far, it doesn't look like there's been meaningful spending cuts. There have been in certain areas, like foreign assistance, but the bulk of the money goes to things like old age pensions and healthcare, and none of that has changed. To change that really is going to require the difficult work of legislating change and getting Congress on board. It's not something the president or Elon Musk can do on their own.
Now, you've written, I mean, obviously as a former sort of Democrat official, you have also written very critically of Bidenomics and saying that it's fed inflation to a great degree, and they didn't really understand that.
I think President Biden started with incredibly ambitious approach and basically flew too close to the sun. And the inflation didn't just doom the Democrats' reelection. It also meant, for example, it got much more expensive to build infrastructure. So we're now building less infrastructure. It undermined things like the child tax credit and the minimum wage, which he had wanted to expand, but he ended up, in effect, presiding over the shrinking of them. And so taking your economics, your budget constraints, unintended consequences, all these types of lessons seriously, something I think President Biden failed to do. Looks like President Trump is failing to do it in his own way as well.
If you represent, I mean, I hope you don't mind me describing you as sort of the Washington consensus or neoliberalism, you now seem to have sort of both the Democrats and the Republicans rejecting that Washington consensus and going for sort of, diametrically opposite offers.
Yeah, and I think there are certain left and right commonalities on the topic of trade, for example. And look, it's hard to explain. When you limit trade, it looks really appealing. The people who are directly helped might even applaud you, might even support it, but it has unintended consequences spread over the rest of the population. And ultimately, the rest of the population is going to have their voice heard eventually at the ballot box and elsewhere. So I think you ignore them at your peril.
So what should any government do to reduce inflation now?
Right now, bringing the budget deficit down, putting the debt on a better course is the main thing that I do. Continuing to improve the supply side of the economy. It's really expensive to build things, especially things like housing and energy in the United States. A lot of could be done there, including deregulation, by the way, that would appeal to Republicans as well. And then finally, inflation is handled by the central bank, continuing to respect the independence of the Federal Reserve and appoint serious people to it.
Professor Furman, thank you very much.
Thank you.